Ridley Scott's parasitic aliens were changed by human DNA. But in real life, and I can barely say it, parasites change us. A super gross conversation with AMNH parasitologist Mark Siddall. Welcome to Science Goes to the Movies, a look at the stories of science and how they change our culture. I'm Faith Saley, and today we're talking about Ridley Scott's Alien with American Museum of Natural History's very best parasitologist, Dr. Mark Siddall. Hi, Mark.
Hi.
Is that a contentious title? The very best parasitologist at AMNH?
I mean, I'll take it. There are a couple of us there, though. Thanks.
When you tell people you're a parasitologist,
yes.
Has anybody ever asked you if you study ghosts?
All the time.
Really?
Yeah. Oh, no, like, are you that guy from Ghost Hunters? I'm like, no, I'm the leech guy.
It's so funny.
Yeah.
So paranormal parasitologist, is that where they...
Well, it's parapsychology,
parasite.
right? And it sounds so similar. Parapsychology.
And when you tell people you're the leech guy, does that kind of shut down conversation sometimes?
Over dinner, but often, in fact, it does sort of intrigue people.
Yeah.
What you devoted your life to studying parasites, to studying leeches, and yeah, so it depends on who the people are.
All of this is going to be very helpful as we sort out the alien in Ridley Scott's Alien franchise. The series began with the horrors encountered by Warrant Officer Ellen Ripley and her continued battles with a face-hugging parasitic extraterrestrial life form. And after 6 movies and 38 years, we are starting to know a little bit about that alien. So are the monsters in the Aliens franchise a parasite?
Of a sort, and they would be what I think most scientists, most parasitologists would call a parasitoid. And they're called that because they're an organism where only a portion of the life cycle actually occurs parasitically, whereas the adult portion of the life cycle occurs in a free-living way.
If a portion of the alien's life cycle is spent as a parasite, it is using another creature to survive? Is that what a parasite is?
And to grow. And taking the resources from the thing that it's parasitic on or in, and taking all those nutrients and allowing itself to grow at the expense of the organism that it's parasitizing.
So we've got 6 films here.
Yeah.
We've got Alien in 1979, Aliens, Alien 3, then Alien Resurrection in 1997. Nothing for 14 years, it went dormant. And then Prometheus in 2012, and now Alien Covenant. In all of these movies, the dark underlying motivation is that someone somewhere thought these parasites would make a good weapon. But none of those warmongers had a good parasitologist on hand to explain why parasites make bad weapons. But we do. So hit me with it. For all the sci-fi writers out there, what is the problem with weaponized parasites?
Well, any kind of biological weapon, much like chemical weaponry, so any of these weapons of mass destruction, the difficulty with actually deploying them is that they can come back and bite you. And of course we see that throughout literally in the movies, it's biting you back, but more figuratively. So if you release some sort of biological agent, a virus or a bacterium, and of course there's been lots of research done by American military, Russian, Soviet military, what have you, in terms of making biological agents for weapons. The problem is that thing gets out in the wild and it doesn't just die, it's still there. It's in a human population perhaps. If you have to go in and occupy the place with soldiers, then they're gonna possibly be infected. What if the vaccine doesn't work? What if it mutates? These things are alive and they can change and become resistant to whatever drugs you've got that you're supposed to be protecting yourself with.
In the latest film, Alien Covenant, we discover that this Xenomorph was created by the android David 8 with the intention of destroying all human life. Could a parasite do that? Could a parasite change our world that dramatically?
They have. And it depends how you define parasites. So if we include things like viruses and bacteria that are parasitic, bubonic plague wiped out a quarter of Europe, a third of Europe actually, 25 million people very quickly in the 1300s. You've got to believe that transformed society in Europe. Or when smallpox came over to the New World with the conquistadors and ran like wildfire through Mesoamerica, through the Aztec populations, and then through the other North American Indian populations, that certainly completely upended their world. And quite frankly, they got their own back at us because syphilis went around Europe in the 1490s on the heels of the Columbus voyages going back. So yes, you really do get transformations in society because of infection.
So if we have that broad definition, does that mean that any time we get an infection, that's a parasite?
A lot of parasitologists will restrict the term parasite to those organisms that are more complex, like malaria or tapeworms or flukes and things like that. And they'll leave bacteria and viruses to the different realm. But that's really semantics. Of course, viruses are parasites, yes.
They are?
Yeah.
Okay.
And some would say the ultimate parasites because they cannot live except inside of another cell.
Right, right. One of the things that makes me totally crazy about this franchise of movies is the characters' complete lack of biosecurity. They let things into their ships. They take off their helmets. In Alien Covenant, the colonists step down onto the planet with no protective clothing at all. Mark, if I were gardening, I would wear gloves,
sure.
Right? Here on Earth, what do people do to protect against parasites?
Well, first, don't stare into the pods. I mean, even in Invasion of the Body Snatchers,
We all know that.
Don't stare into the pods. No, we do a lot of things here to protect ourselves against parasites. I think the greatest invention ever is vaccines. And that's one of the things that we've done to protect ourselves against parasites. We do a lot of other things. We wash our hands. We don't use our own poop to fertilize our gardens, things like that. In fact, a lot of the things that we do, washing your hands is really about protecting other people more than protecting yourself. And so there's an element of caring for each other that goes into protecting ourselves against parasites.
The whole vaccine frenzy and controversy, as a scientist, as a parasitologist, did that drive you absolutely batty?
Not only as a scientist, but as a human being. The reason why the measles vaccine works for something that is incredibly contagious is because all of these other people around someone who might get infected have been vaccinated against measles, and so you can't get an epidemic happening. Now, when you get below about 90% of people in a population being vaccinated for measles, suddenly you can get epidemics. Suddenly people who can't be vaccinated because they're immunocompromised, they're gonna get sick from measles and they're gonna die. And it's suddenly happening because people aren't caring enough about each other.
In the original franchise and once or twice in Covenant, we see the creature on the outside of the spaceship in space.
Yes.
Is that possible? Could a parasite survive in a vacuum?
We do know that there are some animals that can live in space, and these are tardigrades and rotifers. Now, the trick is that they're not really doing anything. They're in a resistant stage where they've gotten rid of all of their water, and so they can't freeze and they can't dry out because, quite frankly, they're already dried out. And then when water comes back, you can reconstitute them. And we've actually done this. We've put tardigrades on the outside of spaceships and spun around the Earth a couple of times, brought them back. About a quarter of them survived, but they weren't doing it. They weren't moving around. So the idea of an organism that is animated and active both on a planet and up in space, I don't know how you would do that. You would have to have their molecular acid blood would have to be liquid both in space at like minus 100 centigrade and on a planet where it's say 25 centigrade. And I don't know of any liquid that would do that. So it's a bit far-fetched. But I do like the story of tardigrades.
That is, first of all, tardigrades are, I saw your exhibit, Life at the Limits,
Yes.
at the American Museum of Natural History. Tardigrades, they can do anything. First of all, how little are tardigrades? Are they?
The largest one is only 1 millimeter, and most of them are much smaller than that.
So the reason we know that tardigrades, which are parasites?
No, they're not,
Oh,
actually.
they're not. Okay, so technically the answer
That may be
is-
the one thing they don't do. Because, I mean, there are tardigrades in the desert, there are tardigrades in the ocean, there are tardigrades in the Himalayas, there are tardigrades in your backyard, there are tardigrades in Central Park. I don't know, there might be tardigrades in this carpet, it wouldn't surprise me.
So tardigrades are not parasites. So you can't think of any parasites that do live in space? That can live in space?
I wonder if there's a parasite of tardigrades.
Oh, don't ask me.
Because if there is, then that would be one.
Over 38 years, we've seen the alien parasite change. Our distant cousins, the unnamed melanin-deficient aliens of Prometheus, created a parasite with the intention of sending it to Earth to kill all humans. We don't know why. The android David 8, because he's nuts, takes that original parasite and slips it to the unsuspecting scientist Holloway, who should not be drinking so much booze in space. Holloway has sex with Shaw, and Shaw gives birth to a new form of parasite. Lots of blood, gore, and really poor biosafety ensues until that new form of parasite attacks another humanoid alien, producing an even more humanoid creature. Jump to Covenant, And crazy David 8 has spent all his free time in space perfecting a breeding program, mixing lots of human DNA with the parasite to make the face grabber we've all come to know and fear. Okay, please, Mark, tell me that none of that is possible, that a parasite cannot swap DNA with more complex organisms.
Well, there's a lot of things going on there in terms of what's possible and plausible, but in terms of swapping DNA, unfortunately, there is precedent for that. About half of your genome is probably historically parasitic. So there are these things called retroviruses. HIV, for example, is a retrovirus. It doesn't do this, but probably over 1 billion years ago, and certainly in one big event that happened about 500 million years ago, there have been these things called retro elements that are in our DNA. They're jumping genes, they jump around. They actually some of them code for an enzyme that causes them to come out of the genome and go somewhere else, and they exist only to make more of themselves, the selfish gene, if you will. Some of those then at some point develop the ability to form a virus and then go jump around to other organisms besides the one that they're in. And about half of our genome is made up of this stuff.
Why are they called retro? Is it
Because
retro like mean looking back?
No, because the element itself codes for a gene that after the gene jumps out of the genome, codes for an RNA molecule, can then make a copy of DNA from the RNA, which is backwards to the way things normally go. That DNA copy then gets inserted somewhere else in the genome, where most of the time it doesn't have any effect, but sometimes it can actually have a profound effect.
Do you study all of this kind of stuff that you're describing to me?
Some of them, yes. In fact, we just recently have been working on a retro element that codes for a cancer that is now contagious amongst different species of bivalve mollusks, clams. And we've been able to show that it jumps from one clam species to another.
That's terrifying.
For clams.
Yeah, but the implications of cancer being contagious.
Yes, well, in fact, there is a cancer that's contagious amongst the Tasmanian devils. Which is another one of these retro element caused cancers. And they're able to give each other cancer by biting each other. It's terrifying.
Yes, it is. Feline leukemia is contagious too, is that right?
Yeah, but that's actually a virus. That's very much like HIV, though there is actually a venereal disease amongst dogs that is one of these contagious cancers, and it's transmitted by sex amongst dogs. You can do a lot of different things if you give evolution enough time.
Yeah. What do you think of the evolution of this fictional parasite? You know, so from black liquid in Prometheus to the egg sacs of Covenant, and then this xenomorph predator of Alien.
Yeah, I don't think, so I wouldn't call it evolution because clearly it's being directed by someone all the time. In the case of Crazy David 8, he's doing it and he's really being an engineer. I'll remind you that it's not mad scientists in these movies, it's always a mad engineer who wreaks havoc or says, let's throw the switch or let's try to make this crazy thing and set it loose. Scientists are usually the ones who get ignored at the beginning of disaster movies.
It's true.
But it's more engineering, and we do this. We've done this with dogs. You know, a Great Dane is the same species as a pug, and yet they look very, very different. But that's because we've been doing engineering through breeding. So it is a kind of engineering. It's not evolution. And what distinguishes it is that evolution occurs in a landscape where the origin of new traits is purely random, and whether or not they survive in some population has to do with whether or not those individuals with it have some success over the ones that don't. And what's very different here is that here's a parasite that when you let it loose on the engineer's planet, notice they're engineers, right? On the engineer's planet, it wipes out every animal on the planet, boom, and then it stops. So that's not really an efficient way to evolve because you've just gotten rid of all the hosts that you depend on.
Right.
And then you're stuck.
Do parasites interbreed? Or, I mean, are they ancient and unchanged, or do they morph like a virus?
Oh, they change all the time. Take malaria parasites, for example. Back in the 1950s, the first big drug back in the 1940s, the first big drug for malaria was quinine. It came from the cinchona tree in South America. You could extract from the bark and you could cure people of malaria. But quinine and some of the quinoline derivatives, we can't use them anymore. Mefloquine doesn't work anymore. The most recent drug, artemisinin, that came from the wormwood plant in China, there's now evidence of resistance to that particular drug as well in malaria. And this is all evidence that the malaria parasite evolves in response to some kind of selective force. And the selective force is the presence of these drugs.
So is this part of the whole concern about antibiotics being overprescribed for
Absolutely.
all sorts of
Absolutely.
illnesses?
We're actually creating an evolutionary pressure that tends to select for those organisms that are resistant.
That to me is the most terrifying horror movie. That's realistic, right? Is just that we will have illnesses that we can't treat?
The terrifying horror movie is the one with the loss of forests and loss of biodiversity so that we've got no more bacteria to go get new antibiotics from.
Because I didn't even think about that. Our antibiotics come from natural sources?
Sure. They come from soil bacteria, they come from bacteria in sludge, they come from plants.
When we all talk about concern about, well, most of us talk about concern about climate change, people aren't talking about that subject that you just described. I mean, there's so much to be concerned about, but you're even talking about saving our own lives eventually.
Oh, absolutely. Loss of biodiversity, that's our hedge against the changing world.
When we think of biodiversity, we usually think of, oh, animals are going to start going extinct, but people are going to start going extinct because we'll get sick and can't cure ourselves anymore.
Parasites are going to go extinct. I love parasites.
I know. What will you have to study? Aren't you the president of the American?
I was.
What is it called? The
I was past president.
Society of Parasitologists.
The American Society of Parasitologists.
Yeah, you'll lose your legions.
Exactly. What'll I do?
Does anybody breed or engineer parasites?
Yes, and in two different ways. The one we've already touched on, which is for bioweaponry, which is really unfortunate. But and there are cases where that's already killed some people, mostly people working on it. There was a guy named Nikolai Ustinov in Soviet Russia who was working to weaponize Marburg virus. This is one of these hemorrhagic fever viruses like Ebola. And they got a really virulent form, and he was trying to inject a hamster, and he missed. So now we know what the effect of this really virulent strain of Marburg virus is like, because over the course of the next few days, as he was bleeding from his fingers on the pages, he was writing out all of his symptoms, and then he died.
Oh my gosh.
What's worse is, because he died so quickly, the Soviets took his corpse and extracted the virus from it so that they could actually produce more of it.
So that virus is somewhere in Russia?
Let's hope they got rid of it.
Explain to me what bioweaponry is as it exists now.
Well, there are conventions against doing that. You're not supposed to do that. So signatories to these international conventions agree that they're not going to work on biological weapons. So we take it for granted that the United States and Russia and China are not developing bioweapons because they're signatories to these particular conventions. Are they in freezers somewhere? We know that smallpox is still in freezers.
I guess, I mean, you touched on this earlier. With bioweaponry, how could you ever know that by unleashing this weapon against presumably your enemies, you can stop its spread? I mean,
and you can't, and it would be, any evolutionary biologist would know that you can't. So the idea that you can introduce something into an environment and then try to pull it back is hubris.
Are there any real parasites that explode from our bodies?
There are parasites that explode from bodies. A really good example are actually these parasitoids that are introduced into insects by wasps. I have a prop. Can I show you?
Yeah, of course. We love prop science.
Here's a little beetle running along, minding its own business, but then these wasps will come along, grab the insect, and then using the ovipositor, inject eggs into the beetle. There are some wasps that will paralyze the beetle, take them into a little rock cave and wall them up until their young can develop inside that beetle. And then once the larvae are big enough, they'll burst out of the body of the beetle and then finish consuming it and go off and become adult wasps to continue the life cycle. So that really does happen. And it was, in fact, inspiration for the Xenomorph in Alien.
Have you ever seen it happen in a beetle?
I've seen videos of it happening. I haven't managed to catch it in the wild. It would be great. There are other parasites, however, called nematomorphs, and I have seen this. They're worms. The adult stages are inside of something like a praying mantis or a grasshopper, tightly coiled up. And if that praying mantis or grasshopper happens to jump into water, in fact, they modify the behavior of these insects so that they do jump into water. And then they burst out the butt end of these things. And yeah, it's a grasshopper's like this big, but the worm is that long that comes.
Oh my gosh!
Lots of YouTube videos.
You've seen this?
Nematomorphs, yes.
The Matamorph.
Nematomorphs.
How does a parasite change the behavior of its host? For example, how do they make that jump into water?
They're probably exuding some kind of hormone that's affecting the nervous system of the insect. There's lots of precedent for this. There are even fungi that do it in ants, for example. With respect to bursters in humans, there is a worm, the guinea worm. There are very few people infected with it now. There used to be about 3.5 million, but the President Carter and the Carter Center have been working really hard to get rid of it. I think last year there were 24 people who had this.
Oh, sorry, there's a picture behind you.
Exactly, and
wow.
that worm can grow to be 3 feet long inside of the infected person, and it creates a really powerfully strong burning sensation of a blister, modifying the individual's behavior to go seek the cooling effect of water. And once they get in the water, the worm bursts its head out through that, explodes its head, and dumps all of its babies into the water.
That's amazing.
It's diabolical.
It is diabolical. Is there anything in your field that grosses you out too much to see, study, or talk about?
No. Hagfish slime. It's really nasty.
What is hagfish?
Hagfish.
slime?
They're like lampreys. They're some of the earliest diverging lineages of fishy-like things. They're not really fish. They're before fish. They're chordates like us. They have a backbony. Don't have bones. They have cartilage. But they're what our ancestors might have looked like. But they produce a ton of slime. You put a hagfish in a bucket overnight, and then all the water in the bucket turns into gel.
Ew.
But people are making money off of this.
In what way?
They're using the slime for something. It must be for a lubricant. There was a truck of hagfish that chipped over on a highway in the Midwest, and there was hagfish and hagfish slime. It's gross.
So is clean water the key to avoiding parasites?
To a lot of them, yeah. Clean water is really, it's incredibly important. The one thing that we could do for our fellow human beings all around the planet is guarantee clean water and then sanitation to go with it.
You know, when you describe the behavior of parasites, it makes them sound so smart, right? Like you said, diabolical.
Sure.
It sounds so calculated and brilliant. Of course,
it's not.
There's no brains involved, but I guess that's evolution, right? Evolution figures out how to be smart on its own.
Well, but you think about it,
smart is an anthropomorphic word applied to it, right?
No, understood. And really, the trick is to understand that why are things the way they are? Because if the things that weren't this way died.
Yeah, because
right?
the things
what we see is the results of evolution. So all the stuff that wasn't as good as this didn't survive, and something else came along.
Whatever's around still works.
Yeah.
I mean, it's nature's R&D.
And then the definition of intelligence, you could do a whole other Science Goes to the Movies on that. I wouldn't even pretend to be an expert on what intelligence is.
Well, I mean, you're pretty smart.
I'm all right.
You're halfway there.
Sure.
In Alien Covenant, about an hour and 15 minutes into the movie, there's this moment when the Xenomorph seems to be communicating with David 8. You study these critters. What do you make of the idea of a sentient parasite?
Well, it's terrifying, obviously. It would be interesting to see whether or not it would create a dilemma. If this animal is sentient, are we under a special obligation to conserve it like we do dolphins, or people get concerned about monkeys because they might be sentient? Certainly, what was interesting in that point in the movie was you almost felt some empathy for that pale organism as David was trying to communicate with it.
When you see, I find the Alien franchise absolutely terrifying, uncomfortable. I can't really even enjoy the movies. You study a lot of gross
Weaver's
things.
Awesome.
Well, Sigourney Weaver is always awesome, right, at any age. But when you watch an Alien type movie, do you think that you're as terrified as everybody else, or do you have sort of the distance of a discriminating parasitologist, through which to watch?
Of course, I watched Alien a long time ago, before I was a practicing parasitologist, and I was as terrified as everybody else. And right now, though, I think like a lot of academics, I'm trying to work out the life cycle, and I'm trying to work out there's going to be another Alien movie, and they have to try to get this all together. The Deacon stage from Prometheus, and the Neomorphs in this one seemed like a dead end. Now we've got what looks like the first Xenomorph, and how do they bring this together with the engineers, and was there evolution of those people too? They don't always look the same. And so there is a bit of an academic interest in it, but a good suspenseful movie is still a good suspenseful movie.
What is the movie that has scared the pants off of you?
Changeling. When I was 12 years old.
Tell me about it. Why?
It's sort of, it involves ghosts. It involves, I can't remember. I remember this red, white, and blue ball that somebody threw into a lake, and then they went home, and this wet ball came down the stairs. Ba-doink, 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 ba-doink. It's got nothing to do with aliens.
That is terrifying.
Isn't it?
Yeah. But again, it goes back to dirty water, though. I'm telling you, something about the dirty water.
Probably the dirty water.
Started you on your road to parasitology.
I know. I don't like clowns either, so I'm not going to go see it.
Okay. Mark.
Yes.
Thank you for joining us again and for bringing your props. That's all we have time for.
Thanks for having me. This has been fun.
For all of you watching, be sure to check out our Science Goes to the Movies Facebook page for web-only clips and keep up with everything related to Science Goes to the Movies all in one place. And if you want to watch past episodes or download our new podcast, check us out at cuny.tv.